You ever get that sense that something massive is shifting, like right under the surface in Washington?
Oh, yeah. Like the whole engine of government is being tinkered with.
Exactly. And that's what we're digging into today, this really significant effort from the Trump administration to downsize and restructure the federal government workforce.
It's a major initiative, and it touches on some pretty fundamental questions about how government should work.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we're drawing on a whole stack of materials you shared. Briefing docs, news reports from the AP, PBS NewsHour, NPR, Truthout, even the Indian Express, plus some legal takes from Law 360 and BGR Group.
Right. And our goal here isn't to take sides. Just unpack what these sources are telling us. Why is this happening? What steps were actually taken?
What did the court say? What are the impacts? And maybe how does this compare to things we've seen before?
Exactly. We're just reporting on the information, the viewpoints, and the sources themselves.
And central to this, according to these sources, was the creation of this new entity, the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE for short.
DOGE.
Yeah.
Yeah, and initially, Elon Musk was brought in to head it up. The idea, sources say, was his reputation for, well, streamlining things.
Right, cutting inefficiencies. Sources confirm he's left DOGE now, but his, let's say, initial influence and the team are reportedly still key players.
So let's get into the why. What were the administration's goals here, based on what we're reading?
Well, the big picture is definitely large-scale downsizing, reshaping the workforce.
And the stated reasons. The sources mention fulfilling a mandate from voters. That's a phrase used to remake the federal government.
Improve efficiency, streamline operations, those are the key words you see.
And it's also framed within broader conservative objectives. The sources definitely link it to a long-standing desire to restructure the U.S. government.
There's this quote from a former official, Paul Dans, mentioned in one source about needing to join government to shrink it, to regain control. Kind of sums up an approach.
And DOGE was set up to do just that, right? With Musk initially brought in, as you said, for that reputation. Even after he left, the sources suggest the mission didn't change.
What really stands out in these sources is the connection to Project 2025.
Ah, yes. Project 2025. Described often as this, like, how-to manual from the Heritage Foundation and others for the next conservative administration.
A government in waiting, one source called it.
Pretty much. Laying out a plan, reportedly quite detailed, to dismantle parts of the federal government and rebuild it, well, closer to the administration's vision.
The goals mentioned in the sources talk about wanting to flood the zone with conservatives, getting loyalists into key positions.
And gutting the administrative state, that term comes up a lot, basically weakening the permanent bureaucracy from the inside.
Okay, so those are the ambitious goals.
Yeah.
What concrete actions did the administration actually take, according to these documents? It seems like things moved fast in January 2025.
They did. Sources detail several key executive actions impacting staffing right away.
Like the hiring freeze.
Exactly. An immediate freeze on hiring federal civilian employees, effective January 20th. Military personnel were the exception.
And the return to office push.
Yeah, reversing those remote and hybrid work policies that became common during the pandemic. A big push for everyone back in person, full-time.
There was also a major move targeting accountability, especially for policy roles and senior executives. This involved bringing back Schedule F.
Right, Schedule F, or rather reinstating and amending it, reportedly under a new name like policy career. This is a big deal because Schedule F essentially removes traditional job protections from civil servants in policy-related roles.
Making them easier to hire and fire, more like political appointees.
That's the idea described. It involved revoking protections from a previous order, and the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, the government's HR, was told to change the rules to allow this.
And for the Senior Executive Service, the SES folks.
Stricter standards, again, explicitly tied in the sources to aligning with the president's agenda. Performance reviews were restructured, and agencies were apparently encouraged to take immediate corrective action, including removal if executives didn't meet the new bar.
Wow. And then the overall downsizing plan.
Yes, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, working with OPM and DOGE, was tasked with developing a plan to actually reduce the size of government overall. Sources even suggest a memo could allow removing workers who had only recently been hired.
And the scale mentioned in Project 2025, firing potentially 50,000 workers, gives a sense of the ambition. Sources do confirm these initial actions already led to significant staff reductions and disruptions.
which inevitably led to court challenges, right? That's where things got complicated.
Definitely. The core legal fight, as described in the sources, seems to be about presidential power versus Congress. Can the president make these huge changes alone?
Or does Congress need to be involved? That's the crux of it.
And a key ruling came from Judge Susan Ilston out in California.
Right. She issued an order that basically put the brakes on the downsizing, questioned if it was lawful.
Her point, as reported, was that while presidents can propose big changes, actually doing large-scale restructuring requires the cooperation of Congress. She emphasized acting in lawful ways.
And that wasn't just one judge's opinion that got ignored. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals looked at it.
What did they decide?
Well, it was a split panel, but they refused the administration's request to freeze Judge Ilston's order. So the halt remained in place. The downsizing stayed paused.
Why? What was the court's reasoning, according to the sources?
They really hammered on the idea that major structural changes, big workforce cuts, that's not something the executive branch can just do on its own.
It pointed to the Constitution.
Yeah, Congress controls the purse strings, approves spending, and also federal law, which apparently prohibits the president from just cutting programs Congress has authorized without getting Congress's okay.
And the appeals court mentioned real-world consequences, too.
They did. They noted the potential for significant ripple effects, citing things like the nation's food safety system, veteran health care. That was part of their reasoning for keeping the pause in place.
How did the administration defend its actions in court based on these reports?
Their argument, reportedly, was that the executive order and the memo weren't actually binding rules. They were just general principles that agencies should follow.
Like guidelines, not commands.
Sort of. But the courts noted that, well, regardless of how they were labeled, these directives did result in significant cuts and disruptions. They were clearly being treated as binding instructions by the agencies.
It sounds a bit like the legal fights over tariffs mentioned in some sources, using broad executive power claims.
There's definitely a parallel drawn in the sources. The administration defended using the IEPA law for tariffs, vowing to appeal losses. It suggests a pattern of asserting broad executive authority, though courts have pushed back in those tariff cases too, limiting that unilateral power.
Okay, so legal battles aside for a moment, what about the actual impact on federal employees and the system? The sources paint a picture of significant disruption.
Oh, absolutely. The numbers mentioned are striking. At least 75,000 federal employees reportedly took deferred resignation offers.
Thousands of probationary workers let go, and tens of thousands fired or put on leave overall.
It's clearly caused major upheaval. And a big worry you see reflected in the sources, especially connected to Schedule F, is this idea of returning to a political spoils system.
You mean jobs based on who you know or political loyalty, not what you know?
Exactly. Sources quote Professor Mary Guy expressing fear about that, about the potential for chaos and losing expertise if the nonpartisan civil service is undermined.
And kind of ironically, sources reported mass resignations happening within DOGE itself.
Yeah, over 20 civil servants quit, reportedly protesting what they saw as a politically driven effort to dismantle public services, not just make them efficient.
There were even some more serious concerns mentioned, like national security.
Right. Sources mention reports about DOGE staffers potentially having access to things like nuclear secrets, and even suggestions that DOGE might try to place agents inside nonprofits that get federal money. Serious stuff being discussed.
When you think about government reform, it helps to look back. The sources often bring up the Clinton administration's Reinventing Government initiative.
Yeah, led by Al Gore back in the 90s. That also aimed to streamline government, save money. It's a natural comparison point.
But the sources highlight some key differences, don't they?
They do. For instance, the Clinton effort was reportedly authorized by bipartisan congressional legislation, so Congress was on board from both sides.
And it was slower, more collaborative.
Seems like it. Described as working slowly over several years, identifying problems, and this seems important, involving federal workers in figuring out how to do their jobs better.
Which sounds, well, quite different from how the current effort is described in these sources: abrupt, chaotic, relying heavily on executive orders.
A very different approach outlined. Though, it's fair to note the sources also mention Elon Musk pushing back on that comparison, posting on X that what DOGE was doing was similar to the Clinton-Gore policies. So, different perspectives there too.
Stepping back again, the sources consistently tie all this to that broader conservative vision, Project 2025. We're just laying out what the sources describe here, neutrally, of course.
Of course. And that vision, as outlined in the source materials, Includes things like significantly boosting the number of political appointees throughout the government.
And shifting law enforcement resources.
Right, redeploying personnel into the field, supposedly to maximize their impact. The Project 2025 manual itself reportedly gets very specific, suggesting things like overhauling DOJ independence or ending FBI efforts against misinformation. Again, just reporting what the sources claim is in there.
And this all seems underpinned by that unitary view of executive power concept mentioned in the sources.
Yeah, the idea that the president holds most, if not all, executive authority and doesn't need much checking from Congress or the courts.
Using acting officials to bypass Senate confirmation is cited as one tactic reflecting that view.
And the implication, noted in the sources, is that Congress's role in shaping the executive branch gets significantly smaller in that model.
So where does that leave things now? The courts have paused the big downsizing plan. What's next, according to these reports?
Well, the administration isn't backing down. Sources quote White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt saying they plan to appeal these court rulings.
All the way to the Supreme Court.
That's the stated intention, yeah. So the legal fight is likely far from over.
But what if the courts ultimately side against the administration on these specific actions? Does that end it?
Not necessarily. The sources point out that even if these lawsuits succeed in blocking the executive actions, a future Congress, particularly with a Republican majority, could potentially pass laws to allow similar restructuring. The underlying goal doesn't just disappear.
So it creates this ongoing uncertainty, like the example in the NPR source about businesses dealing with tariff uncertainty.
Exactly. When the rules can change based on executive action, court rulings, or potential future legislation, it makes long-term planning really difficult, whether you're running a business or trying to deliver consistent government services.
It really highlights the core tension we've been discussing, doesn't it? This administration's push, driven by executive action, to fundamentally reshape the federal workforce.
Running up against court rulings that insist Congress has to be involved in changes this significant, citing the Constitution and existing laws.
And right now, that means the large-scale workforce cuts are on hold, paused by court order.
The pause is active, but the administration is appealing, and the underlying debate about the size, scope, and control of the federal government, fueled by ideas like those in Project 2025, is clearly ongoing.
So for you listening, maybe you rely on federal services, maybe you work for the government, or maybe you just care about how things run. This deep dive shows just how complex government reform can be. It's about the balance of power, legal fights, political vision.
And it has real-world impacts on services and people's lives.
Absolutely. Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe something for you to consider. Given the stated goals of efficiency and control, but also the legal guardrails requiring legislative cooperation and the need for stable public services.
What does effective large-scale government reform actually look like? How do you balance that executive vision with Congress's authority and the need for a functioning, stable civil service? The sources raise the question, what approach is really needed to genuinely improve government in a lasting way?